I'd like to welcome you all to Careers in the Comic Book Industry. This webinar is sponsored by the Hiatt Career Center at Brandeis University. My name is Alexandra Stephens, and I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Career Programs at the Hiatt Career Center, and I have the pleasure of moderating tonight's discussion. I just want to remind all of you that throughout the broadcast, if you have a question for our alumni panelists, please feel free to enter it into the question chat box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to it when it's relevant to the topic we're discussing. Thank you all for joining us, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to our alumni panelists. They are Dr. A. David Lewis, class of 99, and Jonathan Swifty Lang, class of 88. I've had the pleasure of speaking with both of them on numerous occasions before tonight's presentation, and you are all in for a real treat. They were both English majors during their time at Brandeis and knew each other and then reconnected just recently, actually, through both having the same comic book publisher, Archaia. So they've both gotten into the industry in very different ways and have really interesting stories to tell you all. So without further ado, Dave Swifty, why don't, Dave, you start off by giving us your kind of 30-second elevator pitch of who you are and what you're up to.
Well, thank you, Alex. Yes, thank you. It's been 14 years since I was at Brandeis, and at that time, I was already encouraged to take comic books seriously, even as I was taking them both creatively and escapistly. Since that time, I continued on my education to become a comic book scholar of sorts, and also a comic book creator, which I think is what we're largely going to focus on tonight. Getting my master's degree at Georgetown University, a PhD in religion and literature at Boston University, and being a member of several academic institutions. And I think that's my 30-second limit, actually.
Very good. And Swifty, how about you?
Well, I graduated from Brandeis in '98. While I was in school, I was focused predominantly on film with an English major. I went on to University of Amsterdam, got my master's there in film studies. I was a critic for a while, so visual storytelling has always been my passion. And somehow I found my way into the comics industry, and I haven't looked back since. So I guess that's my 30 seconds.
I feel obligated to make the the obligatory Amsterdam joke about, Swifty, were you working while you were at Amsterdam, or were you otherwise engaged in recreational activities, hashish houses, expanding your visual mind and visual capacity?
Well, I definitely worked hard, but I always think it's important to expand one's mind.
You played hard. You play hard too, apparently.
Yeah. We are 5 minutes into this webinar, and that was the first inappropriate reference. So this is going to be a good night. It's going to be a good night. Okay, so
I want to tell everyone at home to stay in school and keep it clean.
Fantastic. So now that you know just a little bit about the panelists themselves, I'd like to introduce the audience to the panelists. So I'm going to launch our first poll, and I'd like you all to let me know what your relationship to comic books and graphic novels is. So have you ever read a comic book? Do you just read the funnies on the weekends? Have you read a couple over the years? Or are you creating your own content? That would be pretty cool. So just take a couple more seconds to vote. Going to close the poll in 3 seconds, 2, 1. Okay, everyone's voted pretty much. And share the results with you. So the majority of you are readers, which is exciting, but there's a couple that have never read comic books. So that's really great to have you guys on the line.
You are very brave. We're glad to have you here with us as well.
So next, I'd just like to do one more poll to let me and the panelists know why you're tuning in tonight. Is it because you enjoy reading comic books? Are you considering or currently pursuing a career in the industry? Do you just want to hear about what awesome Brandeis alumni are doing? Or are there some other reasons? And you can definitely send those in through the question box.
Alex, do they select other if they thought our promotional photos were just ruggedly handsome?
Yes, I'd say that was a good reason to select other.
Okay, fine.
Okay, I'm going to share the results with you all.
Other, look, other.
I know there are a few others.
Hey-o.
So it looks like some of you think that the panelists are very attractive, and 50% of you are actually considering a career in the industry, which is very cool. So let's get back to it here. So now that we've met the panelists, we've met a little bit of our audience, I'd like you guys to tell me a little bit about your publisher, Archaia, and also who are your partners in crime in the comic book industry. So I'm talking about your artists, your graphic designers, and kind of how you fit into that puzzle.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're primarily focusing on our interaction through Archaia. Archaia was founded by Mark Smiley as an imprint for his own title called Archaia. Archaia started with Sirius Entertainment, and then he decided to self-publish it on his own. It was so successful that he decided to expand his brand and invited aboard various creators and other artists who were either developing properties or had already developed properties. I was fortunate enough to already have a property out there that I think we'll discuss in a few minutes. And from there, Archaia has just expanded and expanded, right, Swifty?
Absolutely. They've now recently reached a point where they merged with another independent publisher called Boom Studios, and they've become one of the largest independent publishers around. And I think that's actually a topic that we're going to get to a little bit later, so I don't want to put this conversation in that direction quite yet.
People can really show off their indie cred, though. Next time they're at a cocktail party or, you know, out and about, when someone mentions comic books, they're not just stuck with talking about Marvel comics and DC comics. They can say, yes, but there's also Archaia, and everyone goes, ooh.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And, of course, Swifty and I both being writers, we have artistic collaborators, and we work with different artists, sometimes on different projects. We'll feature a few of those tonight. In addition to some of the that are listed here, I've also had the opportunity to work with Danielle Carcetto of Girls with Slingshots, is her signature strip. I've worked with Jason Copeland, who's now, I think, doing a guest stint on Daredevil, and well, just numerous other talented folks.
Awesome. So, obviously, both Brandeis alums. This picture should not be a surprise, though it's always fun to see. Tell us a little.
Are you on the kosher side, Dave? Is that what's happening there? Just curious.
No, this is at Usedan. This is at Usedan Cafe.
Okay.
I think there was a kosher option. Sure, you had to go all the way down to Sherman Hall to get the kosher option.
See, I thought that was Sherman Hall. I stand corrected.
I'm almost certain there's a Double Trouble Bubble Bobble video game obscured by that pillar.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that I took a break from playing that to come sit with my friends and get a picture with them. And maybe the ones that I still chat with, maybe I should have checked with them about sharing this picture. But yes, that's me in my salad days.
We were so happy then.
Oh, young and carefree.
So, given that you were young and carefree, tell me a little bit about the experiences at Brandeis while you were students that kind of helped lead you to your current roles, however non-linear they may be.
Right.
Well, I would say I was always writing at Brandeis. At first, I would say it was with the Justice. I was working predominantly as a critic and reviewing films, But one of the things Brandeis allowed is there was always the opportunity to kind of break ground and take chances and be a leader and do something on your own. While I was there, some friends and I started, it was called the Third Eye Club, which was a filmmaking club that I believe is still in existence. My friend Thomas Payton and my friend Casey Saffron. And basically, I think some of the things that really pushed me in this direction was I applied for a grant for Festival of the Arts and was able to make a horror film. It was a zombie film that kind of predated the zombie craze. I won't say it was ahead of its time. I wouldn't be so presumptuous, but I was definitely on the edge of things at the time. But Brandeis really gave me the freedom to kind of explore, and it was a supportive environment in which I could really kind of try different things than I would somewhere else, I would say.
I'd echo that sentiment pretty strongly. I didn't get to really strike out in any organizational way. I didn't get to build so much as get to participate in musical theater, the Justice, just like Swifty. I did try to form a club. We formed, I think, a South Park club during its first inaugural season, and I think it went down in the tubes with us. But we tried. If I credit Brandeis for anything or any things, I would say the two things that sort of led me to, or started me on the path that I've come to today is, first of all, it did the job of a liberal arts education. I felt enriched on all sides, from the classics to more modern and contemporary theater, novels, poetry, epic poems as well. But in addition to that great liberal arts experience that also include a background in psychology and in teaching and in theater, it was really dorm life that gave me the most exposure to just ideas and concepts that I hadn't gotten to engage with or hadn't gotten to wrestle with in any ongoing or any focused way in my high school days. So certainly I got to experience other knowledge through my friends as well. So I think that's what made the friendships so exciting. They were both fun, but mutually informative and intellectually exploratory.
I also want to add just something specific about Brandeis at the time, and I'm sure that it's continuing, is when I was there were something called clusters in which you had to take different classes from different disciplines. And one of the things I think that as a writer that one has to do is essentially you have to make connections that may not be inherent and obvious to most people. And I think at some level that muscle, this ability to kind of make connections that aren't necessarily readily obvious, was really shaped at Brandeis. And I was very thankful of having that education. It was a tool that I continue to go back to that I really recognize I was able to develop while I was there.
Yeah, the fluidity and the ability to mix and match and cross-pollinate ideas just blew open intellectual and cognitive doors for me as well. Some of the doors were dead ends, but I blame it on my own brain, not on Brandeis.
Also, fun Brandeis fact, Dave and I were in a musical together.
That's right. We were.
Awesome.
City of Angels. Right?
Yep.
Right.
I was man in background in almost every scene. So.
And I think I was hogging up the front stage boards, right? Okay. I was hogging up the spotlight.
You can carry a tune, Dave. You were not hogging.
Thank you.
So it's great that you, both in your creative careers and throughout both your educations up until your career paths now, you've explored so many different arenas of creativity in the arts. And so I want to talk a little bit about your path to comic books specifically, because as I mentioned before, you both got into this industry in very different ways and also have your day jobs.
That's true.
So kind of take us through your career path since your time at Brandeis. And you mentioned briefly you both went on to graduate school, and Dave, you're finishing up your PhD now. So Swifty, why don't you start?
Well, it's been quite an interesting path, I think. Well, after I finished graduate school, I moved back to Miami, and I was a film critic for a while down there for the Miami New Times. I was also Mark Hamill's assistant for a now defunct TV show, Mark Hamill of Luke Skywalker fame, and I recognized that it wasn't really happening for me in Miami, so I made the decision to move to New York. When I got to New York, I think I had 12 jobs in my first year, and I worked everywhere from Blue's Clues to Playboy to the Museum of Sex. And it was quite an experience. My goal at the time was always to try to make time to write, and the day job was something that I just needed to do in order to make that happen. Eventually, I got serious, and I started a DVD rental shop in Bushwick, which was then East Williamsburg, which was formerly Bushwick. And I was able to be a part of the DVD revolution at the time, organize events, and watch as many movies as I possibly could. While I was doing that during the day, I would finish up at 10 and I would write in the back of the shop at night. Eventually what happened is once the store was sustaining itself, I was able to teach, and I was teaching ESL classes in Coney Island, Brooklyn, and my class was very diverse. And I think one of the things that was happening at the times is Lou Dobbs had his show, and one of the things that kept coming up was the immigration question was coming up during our classes, and the students didn't really understand the way that people were being perceived or represented, and it was definitely something that was on my mind as well. It also happened around this time that I have a friend, Thomas Payton, who I'm still friends with, who made a film called Three Men from Three Valleys about men trying to cross the Devil's Highway into the U.S. And during these conversations, the seed for Feeding Ground basically was formed. Now, at the time, I know this seems like a long story, and I'll get to the point. I had a number of friends I met in the city who worked in animation and in comics, and my good friends, Mike Lipinski, who was working at the time at Blue's Clues, and a friend who came into the shop, Chris Mangan, we had discussed this idea for the concept that became Feeding Ground. Initially, it was going to be a screenplay, and I recognized that, quite simply, it wasn't manageable as a screenplay, and the size of it, it was going to take something where there weren't any limitations. Mm-hmm. And comics seemed to be the right medium for that. I had been a comic reader growing up, more along the lines of Mad Magazine, but in my 20s, I was introduced to comics, and my friend Michael, who I had mentioned, was kind of a mentor in a lot of ways. So from there, we put together our pitch packet, we hit the ground running at New York Comic Con, and the rest is history.
Awesome. How about you, Dave?
Yeah, a very different pathway than Swifty. So mine actually does sort of spin out from Brandeis itself. That is one of the last papers I did at Brandeis, and this was at the encouragement of English professor William Flesch, was to look at Neil Gaiman's Sandman and Alan Moore's Watchmen through what I thought was a cutting-edge literary lens. Little did I know that there was already a blossoming comic studies sort of academic field that was beginning to come into its own, and that had academic conferences, either as part of comic book shows or entirely separate from them. So the work that I was encouraged to do and very thankful for under William Flesch actually became my first academic paper presented at one of these comics conferences, academic conventions. I continued with that even as I got for a year into advertising as a junior copywriter. It was during this time that I found out I was a terrible poet, just wrote god-awful poetry, and only a middling short story writer. But my ideas most came to life when I thought of them in terms of comics, which I had been an avid reader of all my life, right alongside all those classics that I mentioned earlier. So this all basically came together one year at the big San Diego International Comic-Con that you now see on the news, which blows my mind that the news covers Comic-Con. But while I was there giving a conference paper, I got a conversation with a small press there called Committed Comics. I believe they're now defunct, actually. It wasn't my fault. And they said, well, if you have an interest in creative work, we have a story that needs a lot of background and research to it. And I said, research and comics? How exciting! And that became my first written work, though not my first published work. It came out years later, but it got me very much into this idea that as I am studying comics and furthering my education, getting my master's degree at Georgetown and then coming back north. By the way, while I was at Georgetown, I roomed with two other Brandeis alums, one of whom is in the audience right now, Matt Hellman and Joshua Israel. Hi, Josh Israel, also part of City of Angels. So I got to shift back and forth between building my further education, my pedagogy, and my theoretical models, writing about comics and graphic novels and sequential art, and then taking some of my leftover ideas and shaping them into short pieces of comic stories. I eventually moved into self-publishing my own short pieces under the title Mortal Coils. That later became a trade paperback, and I believe you can get it on Amazon for approximately a penny now. I think it's been marked down to penny status. But then it also led to my having the nerve to self-publish a full-fledged graphic novel that caught the eye of the aforementioned Mark Smiley and led me to Archaia and back into the open arms of Swifty.
That's touching, really.
Oh, it is, isn't it?
So now that we know how you got here, I want to talk about storytelling a bit. And Dave, you just mentioned that when you think about a story, it's often much easier for you to conceptualize if you think about it through the lens of a comic book.
Yeah.
And so I'd like you both to use your own pieces to tell us how you use comic books to tell a story in a new way, give voice to a population, start a dialogue, basically be very Brandeisian about it. And particularly, I'd love for you, Swifty, to touch on how you tell the story of immigration. And I was watching another piece that you did where you actually brought up Superman as an immigrant, which I just thought was so interesting. So take it away. The art of storytelling. What's in it?
Wow, no pressure. So I can say that the origin of Feeding Ground is, as I mentioned before, at some level occurred as I was in this classroom with people from all over the world, and one of the things that I often think about is the idea of the outsider or the other and constructing the other. And when one is the outsider, essentially their ambitions are not so dissimilar from anyone else's. In general, I would say I'm drawn to stories about crime where the criminal is a humanist. And it just so happens that these kinds of stories are very de rigueur right now, you know, with your Breaking Bads and what have you. I think essentially anyone who is considered a villain, from the villain's perspective, ultimately has their own set of goals that are not that dissimilar from anyone else. For me, the depiction of people trying to cross into the United States has often been very third person, very depersonalized, and very anonymous. So the challenge for me was trying to find topics and really get into those needs that are universal. This idea of feeding one's family, this idea of having a future, the risks that someone is taking these are not risks that all of us have and our ancestors have taken just to come to this country. It's a very strange thing when we talk about someone being American. The reality is the only Americans are Native Americans, and we all come from somewhere. So to see a population continue to be villainized just for the sake of policy was something that was offensive, frankly. And essentially what we were trying to do was create a hero's journey with a protagonist who wasn't always viewed through a sympathetic lens. In general, I would say that if I did have a goal, I'm interested in examining socio-political issues through the lens of genre and kind of using genre in a way that some of my favorite storytellers have used it. People like Rod Serling, people who understand that conventions of horror and of science fiction are just as valuable as anything else in exploring issues that are happening around us. My friend Michael Lipinski likes to talk about the stories that I work on as being kind of myths of the moment. And I think that's a very fair description of the kind of stories that I'm trying to tell. But I believe that a story is worth its weight, not only if it kind of can speak to the moment, but if it's something that is so universal that it becomes a story that can be told 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And, you know, while I certainly don't have a time machine, I can tell you that the story that I told is going to hold up. I do firmly believe that by tapping into what is human and what are those desires that a protagonist has that are universal, I've increased my chances of something like that happening.
And here's where the scholar in me, Swifty, wants to talk about feeding ground and how it does exhibit any number of the, you know, Campbellian monomythic drives going through it. That you have a quite a good chance with this work of it echoing, as you said, 20 and 30 and so many years out. In fact, you're far braver than I am with what you take on in what you write. You said you do myths of now. I tend to do myths of then, now, again. That is, my fascination tends to focus on the other side of lore that we haven't heard. The graphic novel I mentioned earlier, Some New Kind of Lone and Level Sands, took the story of the Egyptian Exodus, the Israelite Egyptian Exodus, and told it from the perspective of the Egyptian royal family. With the images you see here are from Some New Kind of Slaughter, which is not a horror comic, but is actually from a poem by Robert Frost about world floods, about mythic world floods. So what my collaborator, Marv Mann, MP Mann, and I did was try to take all of these myths and usefully juxtapose them to tease out sort of the universality that you were talking about earlier, Swifty. So it's a similar appeal to me. I think that my reason for doing it through comics is because I grew up, or rather came of age, around the time that Scott McCloud, comics theorist and comics creator Scott McCloud, produced his seminal work called Understanding Comics. And it broke down for me beautifully what it was I was connecting with as I was reading superhero comics or indie comics or classic comics, you know, like Classics Illustrated. The toolbox that he presented there not only made sense to me, but really reached into sort of the creative root that I felt. That, as I said, poetry did not connect properly with, God knows I tried, and that journalism did not connect with properly, God knows I tried, at the Justice, and that short stories did not connect with. But the visual, verbal melding and meshing of comics really did work for the flip side that I was seeing or discovering with these stories. Even the graphic novel that I'm working on now is, again, one of those where I am lifting from a earlier plot from a pre-existing plot, and this is without going into the conversation about how there are only 6 plots or there's only 1 plot. I mean, I'm really taking from a story that you've probably read before, like Exodus, like Genesis, but this one is non-biblical, and trying to probe its corners and dark edges and unseen characters. And they just come to life best in the collaborative process between my scripting and so forth, an artist thumbnailing, that's what we call the little sort of pre-drawings, my revising script, them doing layouts, and the back and forth is what brings the stories to life for me in this appealing manner.
I think that's an excellent point, by the way, David. I often talk about one of the things that I love the most about creating comics, it is incredibly collaborative. It is not something that simply lives
Right.
on the page and is done. There is no better editor than an artist, because quite simply they have to spend more time with the world that you've created, and it has to work on the page. And there's nothing more exciting than when something that you thought was scripted and final is brought back to you with a design that can completely set a story in a different direction than it is anticipated. And I think that a great collaborator, or anyone who's trying to collaborate, has to be open to someone's ideas. And even though I am technically the writer of Feeding Ground, I would be doing my partners a great disservice if I did not give them credit for both keeping my ideas in check when I spun too far off the rails, and also inspiring me to go in different directions.
And let me just add 2 quick postscripts to that. First of all, the images you're seeing here from Some New Kind of Slaughter were actually co-scripted with the artist. It wasn't just I dropped a script at his door and Marv had to go draw it and I got back however he took it. We wrote it very much together, so you can have an artist as true collaborator. The second point I want to make to what you said there, Swifty, is that it is a collaborative process, but it's not the uber collaborative process that a film might be. That is to say, you do get to maintain a certain degree of control, or at the very least not feel that it is overly spread out. And that's another beautiful part of comics. You can collapse the system to a few essential people, or you can expand it to the widest crew or team that you're willing to basically manage.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you both. So obviously you both explore religious and social issues in different ways through your work. Dave, as you mentioned, bringing new light to old stories and bringing new perspectives into that. How do your careers in the comic books enable you to reflect on those issues both personally and professionally? Because Swifty, even as you were talking, I heard, you were getting fired up about immigration issues.
Yeah.
And so how can you both kind of explore those through your work? And I'll start with you, Dave.
Well, I got to say that comics, there's a writer named Rocco Versace who said that comics, no matter how popular they get, they become superhero movies or Comic-Con or TV shows, they still have this fringe status. They started as, kind of an outside product. And it's this fringe status that I still see in comics, even if it's becoming more and more mainstream, that really gave me permission to explore. Even while I was at Brandeis, I was hugely secular, practically agnostic, borderline atheistic. I thought I knew that religion was not for me. And the only time that I became really interested in any religious lore or religious matters was when a comic book writer sunk his or her hands into it and let me engage it in a way outside the synagogue or church or mosque or temple. So as I got to think about religion through a more open source means, we might say. That's the term now. I didn't know what it was back then. Or look at spiritual matters from a creative perspective, I began to get closer and closer to the idea that religion does hold some appeal to me. So I'm writing these comics not for their religious content, just because they happen to fascinate me. These stories happen to get my imagination bubbling. At the same time, I'm looking at other comic book creators who are dabbling in the same general genre, the same oeuvre. And it led me to come to new understanding about how I feel about religion, about institutionalized religion. I became far more accepting for it. I became a convert from Judaism to Islam, still a rather secular fellow, but one that found a theology, actually could embrace a theology. So if comics did anything for me personally, they let me open my mind in a way that the institutions, my hometown institutions, didn't necessarily, and I've been trying to repay them back in kind by promoting, pointing out, and educating about how the medium of comics and comic books and sequential art utilizes, speaks with, engages, criticizes religious content, as you can see from the Graven Images collection there.
Awesome. Swifty, how about you?
Well, excellent question, first of all. But one of the things that I think comics has done is I've always been interested in outsiders. And I've been able to kind of verbalize this, actually, with a class I took at Brandeis, was on criminology in a sociology class. And one of the things about crime, it's essentially about criminals want the same ends, but they reject the means. And that's something that really is fascinating to me. And what comics has done specifically is all of my stories are about people who essentially either are viewed as outsiders, have made the choice to be an outsider, or have been construed that way. And what comics has really allowed me to do is be a student again. Because so much of what I'm doing is based on reality. At some level, I get to become, I would never call myself an expert, but at least better versed than I was prior to beginning the undertaking. For example, the feeding ground would not be able to be what it was without Luis Alberto Urrea's The Devil's Highway. And that book was kind of it was a North Star, kind of, as we were going on this journey as a team. One of the other projects that I'm working on right now, I can't talk too much about it, but again, I've had the opportunity to kind of immerse myself in research, and maybe that's a very Brandeisian sort of thing to do, but
I love
research. Research is awesome, man. I didn't love it when I had to do it, but I've grown to love it.
That's right. That's right. It's detective work. It's intellectual detective work.
Exactly. So it's given me license to be a student in a lot of ways. So I guess any creative activity at some level has to come from a place of curiosity. So I think comics have allowed me to stay curious, I guess, more than anything else.
Speaking of curiosity, this is a great time for a poll.
Ah.
So we've heard about, your careers, how comic books have really affected you both personally and, of course, professionally in the work you've created. And now I want to shift gears into the industry itself and the nuts and bolts of actually pitching an idea, getting an audience, building readership, marketing yourself, and any tips that you have for folks looking to break into the industry. So before we get into all of that, I do have a couple questions from the crowd here, but I want to ask you all a question first. So many of you mentioned in one of the first polls that you are considering a career in this industry. And so if you are seeking a career in the comic book industry, or in the arts in general, how would you describe yourself? Do you see yourself as an artist? a content producer, someone who's actually creating the content, or are you seeking more of a role within an arts-related organization, whether that's administrative or in the marketing department? Just give you a few more minutes to respond to this poll.
Alex, I'm sorry, I don't see the one for they're just so blisteringly handsome, I don't know what I want to do.
Oh, I forgot the other in this one. I'm so sorry.
Okay. All right.
I feel bad forgetting the other with Swifty online here. He loves talking about the other. Okay. We're going to close that poll and share the results with you. So very cool to see 80% of you are consider yourself artists and creators and content producers, and the other 20% still want to participate in an arts-related organization, but maybe in a different way.
Creators, I sympathize with all of you.
So with that being said, we did get a question, and it's related to this next section. So one of our viewers said, if I'm interested in getting started, are there any avenues for funding, and how do I get the world to see my work? And then we had another question specifically about Archaia, which I know you're going to touch on, which is, does Archaia consider unsolicited submissions?
The amazing thing is that they do.
They
actually do. They're one of the largest publishers out there to consider unsolicited submissions.
And they still actually, I think Mark actually does, they will review your artwork at a convention.
Having said that, of course, one of the first, pieces of advice that I give is never leave yourself to have to pitch something blind. If you can get to know creators or get to know editorial members or get to attend a panel of theirs at a convention, so much the better. Break down as many walls as you can before submitting that pitch. If you have to submit it unsolicited because you live in Guam, which I'm sure is a lovely place, for instance, and you don't get out to comic conventions very often, then so be it. But get those obstacles as far out of your way as possible.
So in terms of pitching a story, just as you both got into the industry in very different ways, you've also come to Archaia and published your works in very different ways. So Dave, I know you first went the self-publishing route, and Swifty put together a formal proposal, which you see one of the pages from here for Archaia. So Dave, why don't we start with you with the self-publishing route?
I would not in itself recommend the self-publishing route unless you have a story and a project that just absolutely has to come out no matter how it comes out. If you have a very ambitious game plan of being picked up by a publisher and then being distributed nationally, you probably want to go the route that Swifty is going to discuss. If, on the other hand, you have a story and a project and a team that you need to have out there, either as intellectual property, you just want to show that you've created something, or simply just as a storyteller, you need to tell this story, then self-publishing has become an easier option than ever, certainly with print on demand, certainly with digital pre-press, that is designing the whole thing on a computer and not having to throw comic book boards everywhere, huge, drawn-out, elaborate details. For myself, I had to tell a story. I really wanted to have just a book out there, so I had to go purchase my own ISBN. I had to contract a printer to print it. I had to store the individual books. I had to send copies out at my own cost. To reviewers, to Amazon. I had to give out free samples in advance of the book, a year in advance at comic book conventions. But I'm thrilled to say that all that work and cultivating a network, perhaps through your own alumni network, or even online through Twitter, Facebook, and any other number of social media, can result in the successful, even lucrative launch of a self-published comic. If it then gets enough attention, a publisher may come along and say, we want to share this more widely. But that can't be your goal by self-publishing. Self-publishing in and of itself and maintaining the social network and that wasn't your speaker, by the way. That was me eating my own tongue. Maintaining your distribution network and your own community has to be your actual goal, unless you want to go Swifty's route.
So essentially, the best advice I can give you is that, and this is kind of tied into the money, because as a writer, you're always hustling. Because the reality is, with comics, regardless of your idea, it is a visual medium, which means you need to get yourself an artist who's excited about your idea. And I would say that the key to doing that, when you don't have any money, which is most of us, what your currency is are your ideas, your enthusiasm, and your persistence. So I was able to get my co-creators really, really excited about this project. And what then happened is that in putting everything into this, because I'm not a designer and I'm not an artist, but I am a writer and I did have a vision, we did have a shared visual language that I was able to communicate through reference. We put this thing together, and we knew our world backwards and forwards. Now, I will tell you also, it's not only about the scope of knowing a complete idea, but you better be able to articulate your story in 3 to 5 sentences where you're going to get someone interested. People talk about the importance of an elevator pitch. I cannot underestimate it, because even while you're out on the floor, or if you're talking to an artist, you should be able to get someone's attention. And if your idea isn't getting someone's attention, it's probably not a very good idea. And that's okay, because as a writer, the other piece of advice I can give you is you should have multiple projects ready to go, because things always happen, always. So I don't know if I fully answered your question, but I think some of the other advice is worthwhile. So I hope that helps.
Swifty, can you talk a little bit more about your day job and how that also helps to inform how you can increase your audience base through marketing?
Well, absolutely. I'm now working for a digital marketing company, and I am basically doing things that didn't exist 3 to 5 years ago. I'm writing tweets and doing community management and Facebook posts and kind of monitoring paid marketing online. And essentially what's happened is that in promoting Feeding Grounds, I was able to build a Twitter profile, I was a bit able to learn about blogging, and all of that kind of transitioned into this professional world, which now I'm trying to understand essentially about the importance of finding an audience, being able to get someone material that might interest them, because ultimately it's very difficult to appeal to everyone all the time. I think what's essential now is about knowing who your audience is and delivering them content that they find engaging. And it's difficult because you have to wear 2 hats. You really have to both be an artist who's excited about creating work to change people's minds, and you have to be a marketer and understand that you have a product that is existing in a space that people ideally are exchanging money for goods and services. So you kind of have to straddle basically both of these lines, this line at the same time. And I think that the day job, on just a smaller level, during my interview process, I compared writing the tweet at 140 characters not being dissimilar from the act of filling in a word bubble on a panel. So being concise and being very specific about word choice was something that kind of was a natural transition between comic writing and social media.
Fantastic. So through tonight's webinar, we are able to showcase your work, both as Brandeis alums, but also as artists in your own right and writers. But I wanted to hear from you a little bit. what are other ways that creative work is recognized in your industry? Special awards, conferences, like Dave mentioned. How do you get props?
Well, the biggest thing that happened for me, and I actually realized this looking at this that I didn't mention it, is that Feeding Ground was actually optioned by Edward R. Pressman, who was a producer who produced The Crow, he produced Wall Street, he's been around for many, many years. So at some level, the pride was that this story has the potential to reach a much wider audience than just maybe comic book readers. So that was incredibly exciting. I won't say that that's the measure of success by any stretch of the imagination. I would just say that it's been one of the nice things and just to come around through this particular book.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, that is a direction that a lot of the industry has moved in, and that Swifty is due a great deal of accolade for. I do think it's a mistake, and he acknowledged this, that you don't write in order to get optioned. That's sort of a poor business model, but it is an excellent way to basically have your work validated. There are a number of industry awards. Probably the topmost would be the Eisner Awards, named after comics pioneer Will Eisner, the supposed father of the graphic novel. There are several others. I was fortunate enough to be nominated in the Harvey Awards, received the Howard Day Prize for my work on Lone and Level Sands. I do have to say that reviews, there is a whole market, a whole field of comics journalism and comics critics, and sometimes comic scholarship and comics criticism overlaps, as you can imagine. You know, theater critics and theater scholars may overlap in certain ways, or name any other medium. But getting that feedback from professional critics, getting the feedback from just readers, just people who were excited to have gotten the story, is terrific. I will plug that right now people can vote at theacademicminute.com. I believe that's the right URL. It's from Radio WAMC, and I did a bit with them on the afterlife in comic books, and was recently nominated for a Listener Choice Award. So if you like a little of what you're hearing tonight, you are welcome to vote with your thumbs by going to the Academic Minute and telling them that you liked what you imagine would be just a minute of my talking.
I also have to add one thing about comic press, or even, you know, the state of how things are reviewed right now, is that there are many, many credible outlets out there, but there are also a lot of haters out there, and it's certainly a sport to tear apart work at this point. And I think at some level, if you're doing this, you can't really do this for any sort of accolades or reviews or any sorts of achievements in that regard. This really has to come from a place where you have a story that has to be told. I think anything that comes after that is wonderful, you know, but it's a climate where, because the ability to offer opinions is so readily available, you have a lot put out there that is, quite frankly, just detrimental and hurtful. And you can really, it doesn't take a lot to write a negative review. Something that you work on for 3 years can basically be debunked in what takes someone 25 minutes.
And
so it's...
Right.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to add, to be fair, Swifty, both you and I have had the benefit, have had the honor of taking our time with these projects, taking great periods of time while we have other income coming in. There are some people who leap into being full-time writers or full-time artists or full-time colorists, inkers, you name it, and they're doing it for the payday. And I give them great respect for that. I don't disparage them for not artistically slaving over every panel the way that I might romantically consider myself or my collaborators doing. So we're very much coming from the perspective of assuming you are able to work this out with other income, do it for the story. I'm sure there are others out there that are just taking on jobs and gigs and hopping from contract to contract because they frankly have rent to pay.
Absolutely, and that is a very, very real concern. I mean, the other thing, just to be fair, is the amount of man hours that it takes to draw a page is simply longer than it takes to write a page. And I think
woman hours. Woman hours are important also.
Yes, woman hours as well. But just strictly the amount of time that it takes, and I think that, again, as a writer in this medium, you have a certain luxury of being able to take on multiple projects and to also even take on a day job. I think that if you're a full-time artist and you're in this medium, you don't really have a choice. To be the best of the best, they say the minimum you need to do is a page a day. There are plenty of people who cannot even hit that mark, but to be a professional, that is, I think, the bare minimum. And it is a full-time commitment.
So Swifty, going off of that, and we only have a few minutes left, and we have a few more questions and one from the audience. So this question that just came in is to that point. So how do you keep your passion for your projects in check while still doing what you need to do to feed yourself and pay the bills?
That's an excellent question. I think at some level, the less time, free time one has, the easier it actually is to structure their time. I found that when there's been too much time, which has been a rare occurrence in my life, I haven't been nearly as productive. I think that if you have to do this, you're going to do this, and you're going to find a way to get it done, because the odds are not in your favor. Things do come up, things do fall through. But as I said before, your persistence and your enthusiasm are ultimately what is going to allow you to complete a project.
Awesome.
I very much agree with what Swifty's saying. I couldn't say it better.
So, given your experience, could you tell us just briefly about how you see the current landscape of the comic book industry? So really, what have been the major changes in recent years, particularly with the influence of technology on content distribution? Because I imagine it's opened up a larger playing field, but at the same time, increased competition for getting your work out there.
Yeah, I think one wall has fallen while another wall has gone up. And I think that the wall of creation tools or access to communities of other artists, or even branching out on your own and wanting to take on art if you don't have that training, I think that wall has fallen. We have people doing web comics. We have people who are using things like just bit strips to communicate their stories and ideas. And conversely, we have artists who are able to share more digitally on things like DeviantArt. That's a website, DeviantArt, and get immediate feedback to sort of cultivate what sort of narrative they're delivering. So that wall has fallen. The wall that's gone up is that people are noticing comic books now, are thinking about it in terms of the profits that can be made for it, the ancillary profits that can be made from conventions that have exploded, become huge, huge cultural events. And in that way, it becomes more and more different to differentiate your product from, or story or idea from all the others.
I would also say, getting back to fundraising, yes. I know a number of artists who've actually been able to get projects off the ground through Kickstarter, and I don't remember where I read this, but apparently Kickstarter, if you break down the numbers, is one of the largest independent comic book publishers that there are, just based on all the projects that they've been able to fund. An artist I'm working with right now, Scuds McKinley, just got a book off the ground through Kickstarter and was able to put something out there. And I think he did it the way that it needs to be done, with cultivating an audience, with being transparent, with being enthusiastic. All of that really matters. You know, people want to see not only the end result, people want to feel connected to your process. And I think that that's really something technology has allowed to happen, is that if you are able to connect to someone as they're creating, then you're going to have a connection there and really believe in the artist and their work.
There are still traditional funding tools like the Xeric grant, that's Xeric. Some universities and colleges offer some funding or stipends for different creative projects. But yeah, Kickstarter and other charitable sources like Indiegogo, these have become just a remarkable start point for any number of comic projects. But if you have to have the passion and enthusiasm to convince others to part with their money that early on.
And also understand, I mean, I can't emphasize this enough, but it's a community. You know, if you want to do this, go to conventions, talk to artists, support other people's work. You can't not support other people's work and expect them to support yours. It's very important.
So thank you guys so much. We are a bit over time, but everyone seems to be very engaged. So just a couple more questions, and if the audience has any last-minute questions that you want to get in, now's the time to type them in. But what is your last pieces of advice for folks looking to break into the industry? Really, what are the opportunities that exist in the industry beyond writing and beyond creating the content?
I think one of the things that maybe Swifty and I try to exemplify here tonight is that you need to know more than comics. I think a lot of people are doomed from the start when all they live and breathe is comic books, and that's what they aim to produce. I think you have to be a total human, a whole human with an education, with social graces, and with an interest that you're going to infuse your comics with that will get you attention and notice, and just people will want to be around you. Otherwise, the social construct sort of fails if it's entirely insular.
Absolutely, Dave. I think that's a great point. I think one of the most important things someone can do is, and this seems obvious, but you'd be amazed how many people don't get this, just be nice to people. When you meet someone, be gracious. If someone takes their time to look over your work, thank them. And also, don't be passive and wait for it to happen. If you see someone that you think you might need to talk to, go talk to them. Don't be abrasive about it. Just stay open, be considerate. These social graces will get you very, very far, because it can be a bit surprising that some people lack them, but they do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that kind of takes us into, well, just briefly, I do want to let everyone know that Archaia, Dave and Swifty's publisher, does have an internship program. So if we have any students that are on the line right now, you can go to archaia.com/internship and learn about those. They have them for all different times in the year, both in Chicago and LA, I believe.
And I can say one thing about the internship program, just from my experience. One of the editors who I've been lucky enough to work with, Rebecca Taylor, when I first met her at Archaia, she was an intern. And this was back at San Diego a couple of years ago, and now she is a full editor at Archaia, and she is one of the brightest editors I've worked with. So these internships actually do matter, and it's very, very important to take them and have a fantastic attitude while you're doing them, because it's a very small industry.
Tell them we sent you.
Yeah.
And so speaking of that, referrals and alumni referrals, what are your thoughts on the power of an alumni network, particularly in the entertainment industry, in the arts? It's tough out there, but you're not alone.
Yeah, I think that short of it becoming some version of a boys' club and replace boys with, whatever adjective you want to use there, so long as it never becomes exclusive, but rather inclusive, alumni networks are a tremendous opportunity to introduce you to people outside of that network, right? To link you across the network or link you to someone inside the network. I wish that as an undergraduate I had taken greater advantage, and as a younger alumni I had taken even further advantage of this.
I mean, I will also say, and this is something to be mindful of, we're still a very young university. And I think that some of the networks that we are competing with, and it is a competition, are more established simply because of time. You know, I think that both Dave and I, one of the reasons that we're doing something like this is we want to help build that network because it is essential. And, you know, I can tell you that from my experience, what Dave and I have accomplished, that really could have been much, I wouldn't say easier, but more efficient had there been that network in place. And
I only recently found out that Elliot Maggin, the comic book writer who did Miracle Day for Superman, is Brandesian. How did I not tweak to that earlier? And
yeah, I had no idea. That's interesting. He should be here instead of us, honestly.
We're gonna get him next time.
Yeah, but it's a network is a very, very important thing, and you know, anything that you can do to tap into your network, to reach out to people who are willing to talk to you, and you have to take advantage of that. It's a very important thing.
Gentlemen, it has been such a pleasure, and this is one of the big perks of my job, is that I get to reach out and connect with Brandeis alumni doing such amazing things, help share their career stories with a larger audience, and really bring the Brandeis community together. So I thank you both so much for your time. And
we're looking forward to the Hiatt Center graphic novel coming out from you shortly.
Yes, I am. My creative juices are flowing. You've certainly inspired me. And I do want to let the audience know that Swifty and Dave have both agreed. First of all, shameless plug, they want more Twitter followers, as always.
Hit me up on Twitter.
But they're also very happy to answer any of your lingering questions that you may be able to fit into 140 characters or less. And so here's their contact info. We've got their websites, Facebook, Twitter. Do contact them. They'd love to hear from you. And then next steps, I just want to invite you all to please complete our satisfaction survey. Let us know how we did tonight, how these two guys did tonight, if they entertained you and inspired you as much as they did for me. I'd also want to remind you that we do have a monthly career webinar series on tons of different topics, from networking to careers in X, Y, and Z to and everything in between. So we have one coming up in January. Stay tuned. You'll be receiving an email about it. And then also I wanted to remind Brandeis students and alumni, for those of you who are on, that the Hiatt Career Center does offer free career services for life to all Brandeis undergrads and undergraduate alumni. So here's the contact info, and we hope you'll contact us. So on behalf of the Hiatt Career Center and Brandeis, thank you so much to Dave Lewis and Jonathan Lang for joining us tonight. You guys have been awesome.
You were awesome. Thank you so much for making this happen.
And to be continued, all of you will be receiving a link to the archived version in your email, and let us know how we did. So good night from Brandeis.
Good night.